Hi, welcome to Human Anatomy and Physiology 2. This is Bio 251. It's the second semester of um, Human Anatomy and Physiology. The first thing we're going to talk about is the integumentary system. And so we're going to do an overview of the integumentary system. In the first semester, you covered the different systems, body systems. Integumentary system is the biggest of the systems. It covers your whole body. It's your skin. And it is the first line of defense against foreign invaders. So what are the functions of integumentary skin or integumentary system or skin? It's first and foremost a barrier, right? Its main functions include protection against foreign invaders, right? Body temperature regulation, and you should have covered this in the first semester with thermoregulation, cutaneous sensations. So when things brush against you, whether it's, your pet or, you bump into something, those receptors get triggered and that causes nervous impulse to go to your brain and excretion of wastes. Integumentary system consists of skin, that's the main one, right? And then you have accessory organs like your hair, nails, sweat glands, and sebaceous oil glands. Your skin consists of two distinct regions. So the epidermis is the more superficial or the most superficial region, right? It is epithelial tissue, so it's stratified epithelium, and it is avascular. What does avascular mean? It means that there is no blood supply directly running through that, right? So where does the epidermis get all of its nutrients from? It gets it from the dermis, right? So the dermis is vascular. It's below, or it's more deep to the epidermis. It's right below the epidermis. It's made of mostly fibrous connective tissue. And we'll get into it a little bit more in the next slides. The hypodermis is not considered part of the skin, but it shares some of those functions, right? So this is superficial fascia. So when you are pulling skin off of, let's say, a chicken breast or what have you, like a piece of meat, the white fibrous stuff that you pull off, that is cerebellar connective tissue, and that's part of your superficial fascia, so that you're pulling off the epidermis and dermis and leaving parts of the hypodermis intact. Okay. It's made up of mostly adipose tissue, absorbs shock and insulates, right, and anchors skin to underlying structures, mainly muscles. So this is the function of the hypodermis. Okay. Here's a picture. And so let me go over the epidermis. So the epidermis starts from this brown layer, right? And it goes all the way up. The brown layer is the most basal layer. So that's your first layer, your basement membrane or your basal cell layer. And then these cells actually go through mitosis and produce the cells that are your epidermis. And as they mature, they move out towards the surface. So your epidermis, by the time you get to the surface, those cells are dead. And you can tell that it's stratified because it's many layers, squamous epithelium. And below that is the dermis, right? There's two different regions, the papillary layer and the reticular layer, and then the hypodermis, which is subcutaneous tissue. So if you're giving somebody, a subcutaneous shot, is it going to go in the epidermis, dermis, or the hypodermis? Right, it's going to go into the hypodermis, so it's going underneath the skin. For lab, I want you to know the layers of the epidermis, the layers of the dermis, and the hypodermis. I want you to know the functions of these three, and I want you to know the different appendages found in the skin, right? So the different types of glands and just different characteristics. For lecture, I want you to focus on, okay, what are the characteristics of the epidermis, the characteristics of the dermis, and the hypodermis? Um, since this is a first PowerPoint in the class, it's pretty straightforward. You can use flashcards for this, for memorizing these. That'd be a good use of time. Usually I don't recommend flashcards, but for a lot of functional anatomy, flashcards are perfect. Okay, so cells of the epidermis. Epidermis consists mostly of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized, a keratinization comes from keratinocytes. They produce keratin, which is a protein that gives skin its protective properties, right? And so keratin makes skin not scaly, but it sort of seals the skin so that water can't evaporate and so that things can't get into the skin. Tightly connected by desmosomes, and then millions of skin cells are sloughed off every day. That's why the epidermis is stratified, right? So if we slough off some of the cells, we're okay. Melanocytes are a type of cell found in the epidermis. They produce pigment melanin. The melanocytes are under genetic influence, so your genes are going to dictate how much melanin you can produce. Some people with very fair skin can't produce very much melanin because they have very little melanocytes. And some people with really dark skin have a lot of melanocytes and they can produce a lot of melanin. What happens when you're under UV light, right? So when you go outside, you notice your skin gets darker. That's because the melanocytes kick up their activity to produce more melanin. And so, yes, melanin and melanocytes are under genetic rule. They're dictated by your genes. You can enhance that a little bit by UV light. Some people, you know, that they go into the sunlight and they get burnt, and there's no other option. They don't get tan, so they would have very few melanocytes. The Langerhans are the dendritic cells, are star-shaped macrophages. They patrol the deep epidermis. They are one of the first line of defense for our immune system for foreign invaders. Then we have Merkel cells. These are sensory receptors that sense touch. We have a lot of different sensory receptors, and the ones that I want you to know are Merkel cells. Epidermis is made up of 4 layers, unless we're talking about hands and feet, which are thick skin. Then there's 5 layers. The thick skin contains 5 layers. We call layers strata. It's found in high abrasion areas like the hands and feet. The normal skin throughout your body only contains 4 strata. So the most deep layer is a stratum basal, okay? And then above that is the stratum spinosum. Above that is the stratum granulosum, and then the stratum corneum. If you're talking about palms of hand and bottom of feet, then we have the stratum lucidum in between there. The stratum basal or basal layer is the deepest layer. It has a single row of stem cells. So these are adult stem cells. They're not embryonic stem cells. Embryonic stem cells are undifferentiated cells. And you can put them into any tissue and they'll develop into that tissue. Adult stem cells are different. They are already committed somewhat to being a certain type of cell. Lately, with therapies, they've been using human fat stem cells. So they'll pull stem cells, they'll pull out your fat cells and then they'll harvest the stem cells from there and then inject them into different places to heal. Usually, though, the preferred ones are the embryonic stem cells, from an umbilical cord or whatnot. These are actively dividing mitotic stem cells. So there's a single row of stem cells, and their job is to go through mitosis, and keep replenishing the above layers. And then as the cells migrate through the stratum spinosum and granulosum, they start dying. And so the stratum spinosum is several layers thick. They have a lot of desmosomes that allows them to resist tension and pulling. And then stratum granulosum is where keratinization begins. So keratin fibers are going to accumulate and develop water resistance glycolipids that slows water loss. Your stratum corneum, then, in most of your body is what's next. These are where the cells start dying. So the cells die, and they become keratinized. And so it's the biggest layer, the thickest layer. It's a barrier, right? Prevents water loss and protects deeper cells. In your soles of your feet and your hands, excuse me, the palms of your hands, you have stratum lucidum. It consists of 2 to 3 rows of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes, so way more protection. So that, when you're stepping across rocks or walking around, you don't get the rocks poking through the different layers and damaging you. Here's a histology slide on the left. Here's a picture on the right. Notice the stratum basale. So the stratum basale is the very first or the most deep layer that's dark purple. And you can see the nuclei. They're dark, well, they're like a purplish blue, I guess. They're dark purple, but that doesn't really help. And so what ends up happening is with the stratum basale, these cells are going to go through mitosis, and that's their job. And then they are going to just keep pushing cells into the stratum spinosum layer, and then the cells are going to migrate through the stratum spinosum. They're going to get pushed up to the granulosum region and then the corneum region. And then eventually they're going to get sloughed off. The stratum spinosum is right here. Notice that the granulosum is way more keratinocytes and way more keratin, and then after stratum granulosum, the cells die, and they have a lot of keratin and no nuclei, and so they're basically just a big barrier, right? It's kind of cool, actually. And then below this is a dermis. And so notice in this picture, you don't see any blood vessels because the epidermis is avascular. And so where does it get all of its nutrients from? It gets it from the dermis. And so if you're trying to enhance your skin functionality, you want to make sure that you're taking in a lot of nutrients, you're drinking a lot of water, because that epidermis pulls its nutrients and water and oxygen from dermis. The dermis is strong, flexible, connective tissue. Protein fibers and matrix bind body together. It makes up the hide that's used to make leather. Okay, so dermis is the hide portion. When you think of leather products, excuse me. The dermis is different from the epidermis because it actually contains nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels. So nerve endings are there. It has hair follicles, oil glands, and sweat glands. So it contains a lot of different things. Other glands like your Merkel glands, we don't talk about it here, but Pacinian corpuscles and other different types of sensory receptors so that you can distinguish between fine touch, coarse touch, pain, hot and cold. There are 2 different layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. Papillary is more superficial, reticular is more deep. Okay, here's a different stain. This is actually a really pretty stain. So if you take a look, here's your epidermis, right? Epidermis, epidermis, epidermis. Why is there a difference in color? So if you look at the dark green, right, the very first layer, that is which layer? Stratum basale, right? And then the cells go through the different layers, and once they finish going through the stratum spinosum, they're in the stratum corneum, and they are dead, and they exist of keratin, dead cells with keratin in them. And you can tell that it's keratin because it picks up, well, it looks different, right? And it picks up a different color of stain. Right below that then is the dermis, right? So the papillary layer is right here. The reticular layer is right here. And notice that they look a little bit different. The papillary layer is a superficial layer of a realer connective tissue, interlacing collagen, elastic fibers, and blood vessel, right? Ridges are called friction ridges. Enhance gripping ability. They contribute to sense of touch. And you have sweat pores and ridges. They leave unique fingerprint patterns. The reticular layer, 80% of dermal thickness, consists of dense fibrous connective tissue and elastic fibers that gives the skin its recoil properties, right? So if you pull your skin, if you pinch your skin on the back of your hand, you can do that now, and notice how it pulls back. The less tenting it does, or the more resilience it does, that means that you are hydrated. The more dehydrated you are when you pull the skin on the back of your hand, the longer it'll stay sort of tented up. But what helps with that is the recoil properties of the elastic fibers. Collagen fibers help, so they provide strength, and then the elastic fibers provide the stretch, right? These guys bind water, keep skin hydrated. You have tension lines or cleavage lines. This is due to collagen fibers running parallel to the skin surface. If you go into surgery, you want to be aware of that, or if you become a surgeon, you want to be aware of that, because incisions have to be parallel to these tension lines. Because if you put stitches against tension lines, the wound is going to rip apart. Flexure lines, dermal folds at or near joints. Okay. So look at the tension lines or the cleavage lines on the midsection or the abdomen of this person. If I notice that if you've ever had a surgery in the abdomen, they do a cut this way. They're not going to do a cut this way because it's not going to heal. So they're going to cut across or horizontally and then put stitches that way. Here's the ridges of your fingertip, right? And then here's flexure lines. Extreme stretching of the skin can cause dermal tears, leaving silvery white scars are called stretch marks. Short-term trauma to skin can cause blisters, right? So anytime you have friction against the skin, your skin will actually put fluid into that epidermis and dermal layer, like into the space in between those, and create a blister to protect the dermal layer. Skin color. Multiple pigments contribute to skin color. The main pigment, obviously, is melanin. It's the only pigment made in the skin. It's made by melanocytes. They're sent to keratinocytes to shield DNA from sunlight, right? So you want to protect your DNA. The purpose of melanin is to protect DNA from sunlight, from UV light, because once that UV light hits the DNA, it can actually knock nucleotides out and cause mutations, and then you have some type of skin cancer. Sun exposure stimulates melanin production for this reason. All humans have the same number of keratinocytes, so color differences are due to melanin. Freckles and pigmented moles are local accumulations of melanin, and again, that is hereditary as well. Excessive sun exposure can damage skin, right? Elastic fibers clump when you have damage from UV light, causing skin to look leathery and become leathery. It can depress immune system, and it can mutate DNA that can lead to skin cancer. It destroys folic acid in the skin, and it's really dangerous to developing embryos. Photosensitivity is increased reaction or sensitivity to sun. Some drugs, like antibiotics, can cause photosensitivity, leading to more of a rash or easier sunburn while you're in sun. Antibiotics are common for that. Also, trying to think, Accutane, the drug that they use for acne, is a really notorious drug for causing photosensitivity. Right, let's move into the accessory organs. So hair, the function is to shield skin from sunlight. It guards against physical trauma and protects from heat loss. Hairs, also called pili, they're flexible strands of dead keratinized cells produced by hair follicles, contain hard keratin, not soft keratin. Hair matrix, dividing area of the bulb that produces hair cells, and erector pili is a small band of muscle attached to the follicles. These are what cause goosebumps. So when you're cold, the erector pili muscle, let me show you a picture of it. Do we have it? Sorry, guys. Right here. So if you take a look in the middle of the picture, here's erector pili muscle. So that erector pili muscle will contract when you're cold. Notice there's a nerve going to it. It'll contract when you're cold, and that'll cause the hair follicle the hair to stand up straight and trap more warm air in this region. And you can tell that this is contracted because it'll form a little goosebump. Okay. All right. Different types of hair. Vellus hair is the fine body hair of children and adult females. Terminal hair is coarse, long hair found at scalp and eyebrows. Appear in axillary and pubic regions of both sexes, also in face and neck of males. Axillary is where under the armpits, and pubic would be in the pubic region, genitalia. Alopecia, hair thinning in both sexes after age 40. True or frank baldness is genetically determined. It's a sex influence condition. Male pattern baldness is caused by a follicular response to dihydrotestosterone. Hair thinning can be induced by several factors, right? So high fever, surgery, emotional trauma, different types of drugs. Chemotherapy drugs are notorious for thinning hair and losing hair because chemotherapy drugs target rapidly dividing cells, and your hair is one of those, right? Protein deficient diets, immune system can attack the follicle. Some is reversible, but some is permanent. Nails, scale-like modifications of the epidermis that contains hard keratin. Okay, so if you look at the side one, here's the body of the nail, right? The nail bed is the epidermis underneath the nail. So here's your nail bed, right? I'm trying to look for the word. And then the nail matrix is where the nail is laid down at, okay? Sweat glands, they're called sudoriferous glands. Sudoriferous. Glands, they're on all skin surfaces except nipple and parts of external genitalia contain sweat glands, right? You have about 3 million per person. There's two main types, Eccrine and Epidermis. Eccrine or Merocrine are the most common, right? If you look at the picture, they're right there. They're on the palms, soles, and foreheads. Ducts connect to pores on the surface. They function with thermoregulation. Okay, so they're regulated by nervous system. So when you are hot, the eccrine or eccrine, the merocrine sweat gland, dumps sweat and causes evaporation of heat. It's 99% water, salts, vitamin C, antibodies, microbe killing proteins, and metabolic wastes. That is what it looks like. Epidermis or apocrine sweat glands are combined to axillary and genital regions. They secrete a viscous, milky, or yellowish sweat that contains fatty substances and proteins. The bacteria break down the sweat. So the bacteria, you have specialized bacteria that live in these regions, and they break down, they live off of the sweat, and they cause that smell. They start functioning at puberty, excuse me. the purpose, they've done some studies on this in psychology to say that people prefer people with a different genetic makeup. So when you smell, they did a study, I don't know, it was a while ago, but I saw it on, I don't know if it was Netflix or whatever, but they had guys work out and wear shirts while they were working out, and then they had them put in these glass jars, and the ladies didn't know whose shirt belonged to what guy, right? And then the ladies went around sniffing the shirts and they rated which ones smelled better. And the one that smelled better to each lady was the one, the male who had the most different antigens on the surface of his cells. So they're called major histocompatibility proteins. But basically, they're just proteins on the surface of our cells. And so the sweat gland tells them, or the apocrine sweat gland tells people who they would like to mate with, because the more genetically diverse or different the person is from you, the more likely your offspring have a chance of survival if you look at it genetic wise. It's really interesting. Okay, modified apocrine glands, earwax, right? So cerumen or ceruminous glands, and then mammillary glands secrete milk. Oil glands or sebaceous glands are widely distributed. Developed from hair follicles, secrete into hair follicles. They're inactive until puberty. They secrete sebum or oil. They have bactericidal killing properties. Whiteheads are blocked sebaceous glands, and then if that secretion actually oxidizes, it becomes a blackhead. We're all familiar with that. And then acne is an infectious inflammation of those sebaceous glands, resulting in pimples. And so the bacteria start to go crazy, and the sebaceous gland gets really irritated and inflamed. There's a sebaceous gland. Skin and protection. So skin is a chemical barrier. Your sweat and sebum contain antimicrobial properties. The pH of your skin is a little bit acidic, and so whenever you have an acid or a base, that's going to fight off bacteria and viruses somewhat. Melanin is a chemical barrier against UV radiation. It also acts as a physical barrier. So flat, dead keratinized cell block most water and water-soluble substances. And then we also have it as a biological barrier because it contains phagocytic cells, like macrophages that engulf foreign invaders. So it's a first line of defense. Skin cancer, most skin tumors are benign, so they're not cancerous and they don't spread. They don't metastasize. Risk factors for skin cancer: overexposure to UV radiation and frequent irritation of skin. When I was in college, I grew up in Wisconsin, and it was really cold in winter, and so people or women like to go to the tanning booths and get some UV light to make their skin a little bit darker. And that's really dangerous because exposure to UV light in this way leads to a really high rate of skin cancer. Some skin lotions can repair damaged DNA. There are three major types of skin cancer, so I want you to know these: basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and melanoma. So let's take a look at these. Basal cell carcinoma is least malignant, and most common. There's a picture on a guy's nose right there. Stratum basal cells proliferate and slowly invade dermis and hypodermis. They have pink domes. They don't spread very easily. A lot of times, how do they get rid of this? They just excise it. So the surgeon will go in, or the dermatologist will go in and cut out the basal cell carcinoma. Squamous cell carcinoma is the second most common type. It can metastasize, so you have to be careful. It affects the stratum spinosum. It's a scaly, reddened papillae on scalp, ears, lower lips, or hands, right? So if you can catch this in time, it's really good because um, you can treat it with radiation therapy or you can remove it surgically. The one that's really dangerous is melanoma. So the melanocytes divide, so they become damaged, they divide, and they metastasize, they spread, and they're resistant to chemotherapy. So you have to excise that whole area and do some type of immunotherapy. So the immune system will attack that region. Take a look. This is melanoma or cancer of melanocytes. You can tell that it's melanoma or cancer of melanocytes because it's so dark in color, right? Early detection of this is key. And we follow the ABCD rule. So if you look at moles and you want to know if they're turning into melanoma, you follow these rules. So A is asymmetry. The two sides of the pigmented area do not match. Typically, you notice if it's a mole, it's symmetrical. If it is skin cancer, it is asymmetrical. B, border irregularity. Exhibits indentation. Color contains several colors, very dangerous. And then the diameter larger than 6 millimeters, which is the size of a pencil eraser. Burns, tissue damage caused by heat, electricity, radiation, or certain chemicals. Damage is caused by denaturation of proteins, which destroys cells. Immediate threat is dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. If you since the epidermis and dermis, since your skin is the primary barrier from losing water and dehydrating, if you burn off those layers, then you're going to lose a lot of water. And so what ends up happening is you become severely dehydrated and you lose electrolytes because they evaporate. And so you have an electrolyte imbalance. When this happens, when you get dehydration, when you lose a lot of water, it causes your kidneys to shut down and your circulatory system can't keep up your blood pressure, can't keep blood pressure high. To evaluate burns, use a rule of nines. Body is broken down into 11 sections, with each section representing 9% of the body surface. It's used to estimate volume of fluid loss. So here's a picture of it, right? First degree burn. So how do we classify burns? First degree burn is where the epidermis is damaged only. Okay, first degree burns, localized redness, edema, and pain. You don't need any mediation. It's going to heal on its own, right? So this would be like touching a hot stove or hot plate, or maybe a sunburn, right? Secondary burn is epidermis and upper dermal damage. Blisters appear. So if you have blisters on that burn area, you know that it's a second degree burn. This can happen whether you pull something out of the oven and you burn yourself, or you're out in the sun and you get really a severe sunburn. Third degree burn are horrible. Entire thickness of skin is involved. Skin turns gray-white, like you see here at the bottom of the sole, cherry red or blackened. You don't see any edema, and the area is not painful because your nerve endings are destroyed, right? So if you burned off the nerve endings, then you don't feel pain. Skin grafting is usually necessary at this point. So burns are considered critical if more than 25% of the body has second degree burns, or 10% of the body has third degree burns. Or if your face, hands, or feet bear third degree burns. How do we treat this then? Debridement, so removal of burned skin, This is horribly painful if you've ever had this happen. Antibiotics, temporary covering, so they will try to drape the skin with moist covering to prevent fluid loss, and to sort of cover the exposed nerve endings of the dermis if you have a second-degree burn. Very painful until you get to third degree, right? And skin grafts are an option. Okay, so this is the first week. I want you to go to the lab stuff, look at the PowerPoint files of the skin model, and there should be a handout as well for you guys to go through. All right, I'll see you in office hours, and have a great rest of your week and be safe.